Hey, everybody. Today we're going to continue on studying cities. Today we're going to start with the differences between qualitative and quantitative data. We're also going to focus on different areas in the cities. We're going to talk about suburbanization as well as shanty towns and squatter settlements. And then we're going to talk about some challenges that cities face. So to start off with, a couple of math terms that we're bringing into Human Geo today. Quantitative data is all about numbers, how much of something. So when we're talking about quantitative data about a city, most of that information we find from the census. The census, of course, just a review, happens every 10 years, and the census is just a population count. It checks the demographics of a place, it checks the ages of a place, it checks the racial and ethnic makeup of a place. So census data as well as survey data also help to find information about changes in the population makeup of a city as well as the size of urban areas. And this year, 2020, is a very important year in the United States. We are having our census this year, and that's going to help to figure out, is the population of the United States growing? What states are seeing or having population increases? What states are seeing population decreases? That also leads to redistricting and what states get how many representatives in the House of Representatives. So it's really important. So the quantitative data is all about the numbers, how much of something. Qualitative data is about basically how good something is or the effectiveness of something. And so qualitative data, when I think of that, I think of quality, how quality or how much quality does something have. And so field studies, narratives, asking people questions about particular services helps to give information about people's attitudes towards urban change. So what would be happening if a city is undergoing smart growth or new urbanization or things like that? How do people feel about that? So both of those different types of data are used by geographers to help anytime there's change in the city. All right, so the next topic is about the causes and effects of geographic change. So what causes change in urban areas, and then what are the impacts of that? All right, so to focus on today, we're going to talk about the challenges of urbanization. And there's an important term to understand here when we talk about cities, and that is what's called the underclass. Geographers have identified in some places that where there is what's called a permanent underclass, or this group of people that are permanently in poverty, and how that poverty just kind of goes from one generation to the next. And geographers have also identified that the underclass is not necessarily able to participate in a lot of the things that the cities offer to benefit them. And they're kind of trapped in this never-ending cycle of poverty, hardship, and that kind of stuff. So a couple of things that sort of characterize the challenges of urbanization: people that have inadequate job skills. They're not trained to do certain characteristics or certain things in their job. So they can only do things like maybe work at a fast food restaurant or something like that. This is culture of poverty where you never get out of that. Constantly, on welfare, constantly in government assistance, constantly in housing projects. And how do you better yourself and to get out of those things? That's that culture of poverty. Homelessness. Typically, people that are homeless kind of pass that idea, that case of poverty onto the next generation. Drugs and crime, of course, lead to all of those things, and areas called disamenity zones. So to give you an example of the underclass of poverty, got a couple of scenarios here. The underclass is usually a class of people that does not get a complete education because education is not viewed as being important. Jobs that have historically been able to be given to people that don't really require a high school or college education are becoming harder and are now requiring education. And so people that, don't have an education or don't have the skills necessary to do those types of jobs just kind of fall into this unending cycle of poverty. Another characteristic of the underclass are single mothers, unwed mothers who are giving birth to lots and lots of babies in the inner city. About 2/3 of the inner city children in the United States are born to single mothers. Most of them have to stay home because they can't afford childcare and they don't have a second income to help them pay the bills. Typically, we have what's called absentee fathers, where those fathers are not tracked down, don't pay child support, or either not accountable for the child support. And so that kind of just leads to a permanent class of poverty. A lot of times we see drugs, we see gangs, we see inner cities that don't have places or quality hospitals or quality healthcare institutions. And so a lot of times when you see in the city, to have quality healthcare, to have effective police and fire forces and stuff like that, you have to have a tax base to pay into that so that those services can happen. But a lot of time in the inner cities, people are not paying those taxes, or people are getting out of the inner city and the taxes are losing their basis. So it becomes kind of this further cycle of poverty that is hard to escape from. All right, another thing that's causing issues in some of the urban areas historically, and we don't see that as much now, but there is some examples of discrimination still, but historically we've seen housing discrimination. So the first process, or the first example of discrimination, is something called redlining. We're going to watch a video clip here in just a second that talks about how redlining has been implemented in many parts of America historically. Basically, redlining is when the banks refuse to give loans to people who want to move into areas that were historically white. Okay, certain parts of the city that were white areas or white neighborhoods, banks would refuse to give minorities or people of color loans. Terrible, horrible, but the reality of the situation is that was very common in the United States a couple decades ago. Another example of housing discrimination is blockbusting, where people of a particular ethnicity, usually white people that were in the middle class, would be frightened and told, well, your neighborhood is getting ready to be moved in by a bunch of black people, a bunch of Hispanic people, a bunch of Asian people, a bunch of people of color. And so these white people would just sell their home for a price that was lower than what it was actually worth, because they didn't want people that looked differently than them moving into their neighborhood. So obviously both of these policies and processes are terrible, but that did lead to housing discrimination. So we're going to watch a little spoof, a little parody on redlining and see how, unfortunately, it has a history in America. So this is from a TV show called Adam Ruins Everything. It's on True TV, and he uses, sarcasm, wit to poke fun of things. And this one is his ruining of the suburbs. So this is called The Disturbing History of the Suburbs. He means by Adam Ruins Everything. These redlining policies that have been in place in the United States, that were in place in the United States for decades, helps to explain some of the phenomenons why the suburbs are so white and why discrimination has occurred. But thankfully, we are moving away from those policies and helping to bring about an end to that. All right, so here is some examples of redlining that has occurred here. Okay, the areas that you see that have the boundaries, the limits, are areas where loans were very, very hard to come by in this particular portion of the city. So this is in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is the Hispanic area of the city. You can see it kind of coincides with the African American area, so it would be very, very difficult to get housing loans, upgrade loans for those areas. Okay, this is also Little Rock, and you can see the areas that have poverty and segregation. No surprise that those areas are mainly minority areas. Okay, and so this one, sorry, I skipped it. This is a ratio of loan denials to originations. So most of the loan denials, people that were not eligible for the loans, were people that had a minority, or people who were in the minority. All right, so kind of moving on, we talked a little bit about North American segregation and how that's had a history of discrimination. So focusing on Latin America and other examples of what's called disamenity zones in our world. Disamenity zones are basically the poorest parts of the city. And most of the time, these places... hold on.
Call 348 or come to Mr. Lovett.
Right. Sorry about that. Most of the time, these disamenity zones are not connected to regular services, things like water, things like power, sewer. And a lot of times the disamenity zones are controlled by gangs, drug lords, people that you don't really want to come in contact with. And so these disamenity zones, if we look here at the Latin American city model, we can see that they kind of come out from the market and the CBD. So another impact of disamenity zones is something called ghettoization. When you hear the word ghetto, you typically don't think of a very savory place to be in. So ghettoization is basically where the inner city areas of a place become centers of poverty. When affluent people, most of the time affluent white people, move out into the suburbs, and immigrants, people of color, minorities are there, like trying to get the few jobs that are there, as well as the resources. So this movement of white people out of the cities into the suburbs has been given the nickname of white flight. All right, so we talked a lot about how developed countries and developing countries are different, especially with their urbanization. And one of the things that we start to see popping up in the developing world is something called squatter settlements. Okay. Squatter settlements are examples of extreme poverty, and they usually exist on land just outside of the city. And one of the reasons why they're able to happen is there's not really any zoning regulations. There's not a lot of zoning that prevents these things from happening. Most of the time, these squatter settlements are built out of materials that the inhabitants just find. Now, there is a lot of variation of estimates as to the number of squatter settlements in our world today. Hard to track these for sure, because I mean, if you're living in poverty and you're living in a shack made of cardboard, you're more than likely probably not going to participate in a census. But the estimates vary between 175 million and 1 billion people living in squatter settlements in our world today. That's about 1 out of every 7 people living in a squatter settlement, if we take that high number. So I want to show you some examples of squatter settlements around the world. Most of the time, we don't see them in developed countries, but here's an example of one in France. People trying to move into Paris and just having to settle their places of residence on an old abandoned railroad track. All right, here's India. Squatter settlements are known as bastis in India, and you can see just the terrible living conditions there. The huge existence of just piles and piles of trash, debris, just very unsanitary things. Part of this is it's on the outskirts of the city, and so sewer systems, trash pickup doesn't run all the way out there. You can see from these makeshift houses that a lot of these are constructed out of just whatever these people could find to build shelter. So definitely not a place that you would want to live. So these are in India. Here's another example of a squatter settlement, and you can see that this is built on a waterway, and you can only imagine what that is doing to the pollution of the water. All right, here are favelas in Brazil. Favela is just another word for squatter settlement or shanty town in Brazil, and you can see that they are packed just so tightly upon each other. Many of them are colorful, trying to distinguish between houses, but that doesn't mean that the living conditions are any better. So I want to take a look at a video clip real quick. This is from a family that lives in the favelas in Brazil so that we can see the reality of their situation.
Meu nome é Samira. Meu nome é Samir. Eu tenho 11 anos e ele também. Nós somos gêmeos. Nós moramos no Rio de Janeiro, Complexo da Maré. A minha casa é feita de tijolo. Somos 4. Eu, meu irmão, minha irmã e minha mãe. E temos uma cachorra. Essa daqui é minha avó Sebastiana. Essa é minha mãe, Sirlene. Aqui é o nosso quarto. Tem um espelho aqui, vocês estão vendo. Tem uma televisão, um guarda-roupa, uma triliche. Aí tem aqui, ó, que é que a gente guarda nosso material escolar. Aqui onde a gente mora não tem segurança. E também as polícias entram na casa dos outros, quer levar tudo. Não respeita nem o morador. Mamãe, não deixa a gente sair pra rua, porque tem muito carro, muita moto pode atropelar. Também tem muito bandido. Aqui tem muitos caras com muita arma. Aí ela tem medo. Aí a gente não fica na rua, a gente fica em casa. E mais gente?
Realmente eu não deixo sair por esse motivo. Porque pode estarem brincando num lugar sossegado e de repente estourar alguma coisa e não dá tempo de chegar em casa. Morrer no meio do caminho.
Eles estão cheirando maconha, eles estão cheirando pó, crack. Às vezes eu não tenho porque dá tiroteio. A gente fica sem estudar, aí às vezes a gente fica 3 dias. Aí a gente tem que ficar em casa, vou fazer o quê? A gente sobe pra cá pra laje, a gente fica brincando de bola com a princesa, que é a nossa cachorra. Fico dormindo. Ficar dentro de casa com medo, né? Eu queria morar em outro lugar, porque aqui é muito ruim, não dá. Eu moro aqui é assim. Se tirasse todo mundo que faz bagunça, tipo.
All right, so unfortunately, that's the reality for millions of people who live in the favelas of Brazil. These kids, 11 years old, sometimes can't go to school because of the drugs, the guns, the gangs. But that is unfortunately the reality of life for many kids living in the favelas. All right, another example of shanty towns. This is the Barong Barong in the Philippines. And you can see that these were built over water to try to make it easy to access trade and things on the waterways of Brazil or Philippines, since the Philippines is an island nation. You can only imagine pollution that's in that water, potential for flooding, hazard behavior, lots of deaths occurring there. Okay, so how do people respond to some challenges? How to fix some of the challenges of this urbanization? Well, a pretty controversial policy that's been implemented in the United States is something called inclusionary zoning. So if you don't know what zoning is basically where the government in a particular city says, okay, well, this particular area, this can be used for business, or this particular area can be used for residential areas. And zoning happens when there's an area of the city that needs to be developed. Well, inclusionary zoning encourages the development of affordable housing in these low poverty neighborhoods. And basically it requires any type of developer, whether it's an apartment builder or house builder, whatever, to give at least 10 of their new dwelling units. They have to set those aside and offer those to low income families. So in an area of median income, for example, 10% of the units have to be for people that can only pay about 60% of the cost. If the area median income is about 80%, then about 15% of the units have to be for incomes of people that can only pay a certain price. Now, why is this controversial? Well, it's on the good side, it's offering affordable housing for people who simply just can't afford anything else. On the other side, you are requiring companies to allow people to pay less than what the building is probably worth so that those people can be there. So, it's good because it can provide housing opportunities and better quality housing to the lower class of society. But it's bad in the fact that you're forcing businesses and developers to charge only what the government says that they can charge. So this is an example of inclusionary zoning practices in Seattle. In this particular housing area that was going to be built, the builder had to add one more story of housing that would include affordable housing for lower income residents. So that's one way to tackle the economic challenges. Another example is local food movements. Local food movements are basically providing people with fruits and vegetables and locally grown food that's produced only a short distance of where it's actually consumed. So if you remember from Unit 5, we talked about food deserts and how a lot of people in urban areas don't have access to fruits and vegetables. They don't have access to supermarkets because a lot of times those supermarkets are not occurring in the inner city because it's not profitable to them. So a lot of times only things like Dollar General or McDonald's or gas stations are areas where a lot of these inner city residents can get their food. And of course, we know that that's not a lot of nutritious food. So one of the responses to dealing with that is local food movements. Bringing markets, bringing the farmers, bringing the local farmers markets to the cities so that people can buy their fresh fruits and vegetables and things from there. So that is a potential solution. All right. And here's some examples of food desert solutions. You can grow food locally, which is the local food movement, help to develop an alternate retail outlet. So establishing farmers markets, public markets, cooperatives, farm stands, just any way to provide people with access to fresh fruits and vegetables and healthy alternatives. One of the things that's hard about food deserts for people is the access to the food. Maybe replacing convenience stores with quality foods at grocery stores or small corner markets, and then maybe providing transportation for lower income residents in the inner city to be able to have access to grocery stores. All right. So another controversial topic that's happening in cities today is something called gentrification. Gentrification is basically a process where middle-class people who are moving back into the inner city, so instead of moving into the suburbs, they're moving into the inner city, and they are renovating the housing there. Well, that's on the one hand, this is a great idea because it's revitalizing neighborhoods. It's changing neighborhoods and helping to redevelop those neighborhoods. So rather than tearing down the housing that's being deteriorated, it's been renovated. However, some of the downside to gentrification is that some of these areas, once they've become renovated, the people that had been living there, particularly lower class minority people, can no longer afford the prices of rent. So sometimes it kind of forces those people to move out. A couple of nicknames here for people who participate in gentrification. Yuppies, or young urban professionals. Sinks, single individuals with no kids. So basically, when we're thinking about these people that are moving back into the inner cities and fixing up these neighborhoods, typically it's middle class people that don't have huge families. Maybe either they're single or they don't have any kids, or maybe only a few kids. They can afford to renovate some of these areas. They want to live closer to the city because maybe their jobs or whatever are there. But it does displace some of the local residents. So we're going to look at a example of what gentrification is and how it's positive and negative.
Gentrification is constantly being talked about. In the past 10 years, the number of Google searches for the word gentrification has more than doubled, and mentions in the news and in literature have gone up. So people are talking about gentrification, but they often mean different things when they use the term. Gentrification is a process of neighborhood change that includes economic change in a historically disinvested neighborhood by means of real estate investment and new, higher income residents moving in, as well as demographic change, not only in terms of income level, but also in terms of changes in the education level or racial makeup of residents. Gentrification is complex and needs some explaining. To understand it, there are three key things to consider: the historic conditions, especially policies and practices that made communities susceptible to gentrification, the way that central city disinvestment and investment patterns are taking place today as a result of these conditions, and the ways that gentrification impacts communities. Over the last century, many policies and practices have created racialized patterns of disinvestment in city centers that have left low-income communities of color particularly susceptible to gentrification. From the 1930s through the late 60s, standards set by the federal government and carried out by banks explicitly labeled neighborhoods home to predominantly people of color as risky and unfit for investment. This practice, now known as redlining, meant that people of color were denied access to loans that would enable them to buy or repair homes in their neighborhood. Other housing and transportation policies of the mid-20th century fueled the growth of mostly white suburbs and the exodus of capital from urban centers, in a phenomenon often referred to as white flight. Take the GI Bill as an example. The program guaranteed low-cost mortgage loans for returning World War II soldiers, but discrimination limited the extent to which Black veterans were able to purchase homes in the growing suburbs. In fact, the Federal Housing Administration largely required that suburban developers agree to not sell houses to Black people in order for the developers to access these guaranteed loans. Left behind in central city neighborhoods, low-income households and communities of color bore the brunt of highway system expansion and urban renewal programs, which resulted in the mass clearance of homes, businesses, and neighborhood institutions, and set the stage for widespread public and private disinvestment in the decades that followed. In more recent history, the foreclosure crisis also contributed to neighborhood-level vulnerability to gentrification. In low-income communities of color, disproportionate levels of subprime lending resulted in mass foreclosure, leaving those neighborhoods vulnerable to investors seeking to purchase and flip homes in bulk. Today, both people and capital are flooding back into these historically disinvested neighborhoods. One reason new people are moving into these neighborhoods is because of their relative affordability. In many U.S. cities, the rental market has gotten increasingly expensive, and even moderate-income earners are on the hunt for lower housing costs. This means that in some places, they are looking at historically disinvested communities, often the same neighborhoods previous generations left behind during the days of white flight. These neighborhoods are often characterized by older historic housing stock that appeals to new residents, and close proximity to city centers, where jobs, restaurants, and art spaces are increasingly locating. Cities are also investing in revitalizing some of these neighborhoods, for example with improved transit access and infrastructure, in part to draw in newcomers. On the ground, gentrification may look like real estate speculation, with investors flipping properties for large profits, as well as high-end development, and landlords looking for higher-paying tenants. increased investment in neighborhood amenities like transit and parks, changes in land use, for example, from industrial land to restaurants and storefronts, and changes in the character of the neighborhood as community-run businesses are replaced by businesses catering to new residents' needs. While increased investment in an area can be positive, gentrification is often associated with displacement, which means that in some of these communities, longtime residents are not able to stay to benefit from new investments in housing, healthy food access, or transit infrastructure. Instead, lower-income families, often families of color, may find themselves facing rent increases, evictions, or other displacement pressures, and left with no other choice but to move to suburban or even exurban areas, far away from their jobs and the businesses and service providers they know. This can mean more time commuting, less time spent at home, and increased isolation, depression, and stress levels. For children, displacement can disrupt educational pathways and generate negative health impacts. Even for longtime residents who are able to stay in newly gentrifying areas, changes in the makeup and character of a neighborhood can lead to a reduced sense of belonging or feeling out of place in one's own home. For example, unique cultural vibrancy can be lost as places of worship see their congregants displaced to faraway cities and towns. In addition, family-run businesses and nonprofit organizations may be forced out as their customer base disperses, or as their commercial rents rise past what they can sustain, affecting the ability of those who stay to access the goods and services they need.
All right, so there's definitely some positives and negatives to gentrification. The video talks about how it can bring about a revitalization of neighborhoods and how it can give neighborhoods more transit and a better character and more access to healthier food and better places to live. But it also can displace some of the people that have lived there for generations. It also can lead to what's called a loss of place or a loss of character to a neighborhood. So definitely some positives and negatives to gentrification. So I got a couple examples here to show you. This one on the left here is an example of gentrification in a neighborhood in New York City. You can see on the left-hand side, this particular high-rise building. This is the same exact one, but on the left-hand side, it was run down, not safe, unsanitary, and it was converted to what we see now. With definitely the rent would be a lot higher, but the quality of the housing would be a lot better. Over here on the right-hand side, we have another example of gentrification. Remodeling, revamping, rechanging, but also changing the character and changing who lives there. Okay. All right. So we're talking about how governments are fragmented. The fragmentation of government, or the breakdown of that between different areas of government, also presents some challenges. When we think about the census of governments in the United States, okay, there were 89,000 examples of local government. So, for example, Shelby is a local government. Boiling Springs is a local government. 3,000 counties, 19,000 municipalities or smaller cities, 16 towns, 12,000 school districts, lots of different examples of fragmentation of government. How to make sure that all of those examples of government are treated fairly is tough. And it's at different levels. So, for example, Illinois, which has Chicago, one of America's largest cities, has close to 7,000 examples of local government. Hawaii only has 21. So how do you deal with that is a challenge. All right. So how to address sustainability challenges. So sustainability, of course, review from Unit 1 is just to make things that are available to the next generation of people that kind of renew themselves. So the challenges to urban sustainability, energy and land use are the biggest things, the biggest challenges to sustainability. How to maintain energy that's going to be there for the next generation and how to make sure that the next generation has enough land to accommodate themselves on. So one of the things that we've talked about a lot this chapter is suburban sprawl or urban sprawl. So the spreading out of cities, developments into areas, suburban, rural areas that take away things like agricultural land or recreational space. When we talk about energy use, anytime there's an industry, anytime there's lots of buildings that people live, there's going to be pollution. And so that also leads to a decrease in agricultural land. So all of those are challenges. So how do we respond to those challenges? Well, regional planning efforts through things like smart growth, new urbanism, increase the walkability of cities, establishing urban growth boundaries, so where the city can't expand past certain places, farmland protection, and then the image that we see here on the left, and that's called redevelopment of what's called a brownfield. So if we look at the very first image, this looks like it was a former site of industry or business or whatever, but in this picture we see that it's inhospitable, it's polluted, it's unsafe for development. But anytime you take an area that had been polluted but was in the middle of the city and you convert that to an alternate use, that's a redevelopment of a brownfield. It's important because this area is already in the middle of the city. It's already there, but it's not being able to be used for anything productive. But redeveloping those brownfields, those former industrial sites, and turning them into something new helps all sides. And so we see that becoming very popular lately in urbanization. So a brownfield is just any kind of property where the expansion of that, the redevelopment or the reuse is going to be complicated because there's some kind of hazard there. Maybe it's a pollutant, a contaminant, something hazardous. It's estimated there are about 450,000 brownfields in the United States. But if communities can redevelop and change and fix those brownfields to turn them into productive things, it increases the local tax base, it helps to facilitate job growth, and it utilizes the infrastructure that's already there. So if we take a look at this image here, we see a former industrial site that's polluted, not really used for a lot of things in the city, and then the local community there converted that brownfield into a playground for children. So brownfield redevelopment is a new trend that we're seeing where people are taking existing infrastructure that's been hazardous or polluted and turning it into something positive. Okay. All right. So that is everything for Unit 6. Hopefully that's you've been able to kind of understand through this virtual learning. And as always, if you have anything and you have any questions, please let me know.